history, it's at the very beginning, before there's any sin, all is perfect. At the bottom of page 18, you have 7 questions. I probably have combined these into fewer, but you have 7 questions there. And I'd like us to together answer these questions in relation to Genesis 2, 18 to 25. So what's the epic? Well, we already have said, and it's at the top of your page there, this is the epic of creation. Okay, so now that, if you were actually preparing a sermon from Genesis 2, do you really need to make that point? This is the epic of creation? You say this is at the very beginning. This is before sin had entered. But it is the epic of creation. Now, number 2 can be a very difficult question. What's the main point of the passage? Many times when I teach Bible courses, I usually teach biblical studies. I teach, they'll give me a book to teach or Gospels to teach. And what I usually do with students is I insist that they can always find the main point of a passage. And it's harder than I thought it would be to get people to see what is the main point. But I'm convinced if you do not know the main point of a passage, how can you preach? I mean, you can't preach unless you're going to be just preaching whatever you feel like. But if you want to be responsible preaching from the Bible, then you better know what the Bible says before you now apply it. So I insist that we discover what is the main point of the passage. Now, will we always agree? Maybe not. But I hope we will. To say what seems to be the point. So can you answer? What seems to be the point of this passage? Just beginning from verse 18 to 25. Okay. In a sense, we're saying, why has the Spirit put this here for us? What are we to know? What are we to learn from it? Okay, so what is the main point? Anybody?
Genesis 2?
Genesis 2, 18 to 25. So we didn't exactly read it. I just kind of read parts of it and summarized it. Ruth, you know?
Yeah, it looks like, what we read, the whole thing is an explanation of 18. It says it's not good for the man to be alone. So one thing, the reason seems to be that man should not be alone in that case.
So, yeah, we read in this that God sees that man needs a helper. He needs to show the man that he needs a helper. Okay, but it's God who sees it's not good for the man to be all alone. He's got to have a helper. Okay, so all that he does is supporting that idea, and that's how you know it's correct. Okay, that's the point of this passage, that God determines, I'm not finished yet. I haven't created all that I need to. There's something still. And again, understand, from God's standpoint, he didn't make a mistake. Oh no, what have I done? He knew he had not yet created Eve, but he really, really wanted the man to know this. You see, he could have just created them at the same time, but he didn't. So there must be a reason that he did it the way that he did. Okay, so the main point is, God determines that man must not be alone and creates a helper. Now there are more things we could say, like verses 24 and 25, which kind of draw to a conclusion. Because the woman was made for the man was made for the woman too, but we usually say the woman was made for the man, the two shall become one flesh. Okay? And they should never be separated. And then it says, and they were naked and not ashamed. Well, that's just a preparation for the next passage, where suddenly they realize being naked is a little embarrassing. Okay? So, but before that, it doesn't occur to them that there could be any sense of lack of peace in people's minds. So it just mentions that. So verse 24 is a very important verse because it really does, bring it all together. Now, so when we look at number 3 on the bottom of page 18, what are the relevant biblical theological themes? The main thing we see there is what?
I'm sorry, before we go to that question, can I ask you a question?
Okay.
Has always come, it's probably not connected to our lesson, but this question has always been in my mind.
Well, I want you to feel better. Go ahead and answer.
Here it says Adam leaves his father and mother and unites with his wife. Who is his father and
mother? No. Obviously, Adam is not. No, it's saying because of this, now a man shall leave his father and mother. Because this is now established as this union, now, from then on.
So it's for the future.
It's for the future. Okay. Yeah, it's for the future. And Jesus refers back to this verse, right? Okay. When they come to ask him about divorce, okay, which was legal, right? But it was never ideal. We then learn in the New Testament that it's also really wrong. Okay? It was forbidden, it was allowed for a time. And Jesus says the reason divorce is bad is because, from the beginning, a man should leave his mother and father, they should become one. Okay? And they must not divide. So yeah, obviously, Adam does not have a father. You might say his father is God because Luke's genealogy says that. But no, this does not apply to Adam and Eve specifically.
Yeah, it's because there has been a dispute.
No. All it means is that because of this, now in the future, this is the way it should be. Okay? A man should leave his father and mother and should become one flesh. So the third question on page 18 might be a little, 17? No, it is 18. Might be a little bit difficult because I'm looking for different theological ideas, different theological themes. Okay? Now, there's no sin involved here. Right? So it's not even going to be about that. It may not be exactly redemption because it's still the epic of creation. We don't have a sin problem at all. Okay? What do we have? What do we see? Now remember, what's the whole story about of the Bible? What's the whole story?
Redemption.
Okay, God is redeeming a people for himself. So what you see then, one of the things you see is now God is creating a family, okay? So that from them will be born a people, and therefore he creates a people for himself. So that's part of it. Some people foolishly think that sex was the original sin. I've heard some Africans tell me that, Eve had sex with a serpent. I mean, these are some wild ideas, but they're not uncommon. They do not have children until they're expelled from the garden. And so because of that, some people think, but that doesn't make any sense. Okay? How else are they to be fruitful and multiply if they do not have sexual relations? We don't know how long they're in the garden. We have no idea. Okay? So, does he create them in that very day? Do they eat? We have no idea. So we don't know how long they are there. So we do have the idea of God is, of course, creating a people. Because now he has male and female, and they are now to fill the earth. We see the idea of dominion. In fact, we see these things. Okay, at the top of page 18, I've outlined several things we see in the first two chapters of Genesis. We could say this is a passage about marriage. Some of you might use this passage in premarital counseling, or even at a wedding. You might preach from this. That would be perfectly appropriate. Okay, because it does say something about marriage. Okay? It says something about sex as well, because it talks about the two should become one flesh. Now, does that mean sex? The two should become one flesh? Not exactly. Okay, but it's connected, right? So, in marital relations, okay, what is the purpose of sexual relations in marriage?
Reproduction.
Reproduction is one of them. And centuries ago, that was a given, right? If you're going to have sexual relations, then you're going to expect to have children. If you're Catholic, you are told you must be open to welcoming children. It doesn't mean that every time, obviously, the woman's going to conceive. And it doesn't mean you must stop having sexual relations when the woman can no longer conceive. But one of the purposes is definitely to fulfill the earth and subdue it. Pardon? Now, here's the interesting thing. It builds intimacy. But what does it also do on the other side of that? It's kind of circular. It can build intimacy, but what does it also do? It celebrates intimacy. Okay? And so that is circular. And the way men and women are different in this respect, I think, is that a man often feels like, well, we need to have sexual relations so that we can feel intimate. And the woman often is, no, I need to feel intimate with you before I'm willing to have sexual relations with you. So it is quite interesting the way that works. And I would say a lot of that comes from the fall, in that we now have our own limits. Like, no, this must happen. No, rather than just simply giving ourselves to each other and it not being an issue. Okay? So the fact that we are different becomes a sin issue because of the way we act in marriage. So the man is demanding, but he's not understanding the woman. And so we have these tensions in marriages regarding sexual relations. Okay? Do you see any types of Christ or anything that points to Jesus in this passage? Anything at all? So we're only looking at 18 to 25.
The according to living his father, we can see Jesus coming for the church as his wife, leaving his father.
I've never really thought of it that way, that Jesus also leaves his father to marry the church. It's hard. When does that marriage take place of Jesus and the church? Revelation seems to suggest it happens later. But there definitely is the idea of Jesus and the church and marriage. Marriage is connected to Jesus' relation to the church because Ephesians 5 tells us that. When Paul says, I want women to submit to their husbands as they do to the Lord, and I want husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church. And then he starts going on, and he basically says, but I'm really talking about Christ and the church. And if you look at that, what does that mean? Here's a question for you. Does the imagery of Jesus marrying the church, does that come from the fact that we understand marriage? Or is it the other way around? Did maybe God give us marriage in order for us better to understand about Christ's relationship with the church? So even in this passage, if that is true, and I think it is, I think the idea of the way marriage ought to work is pointing us to what one day Jesus will do as he marries the church. Is it necessary for a man to be married? It's not good for a man to be alone. I'll create a helper. So is it mandated? Is it necessary for men to be married? So all men should get married?
Yes.
But there are exceptions. According to Luke, Joshua gives themselves to the king.
Yeah, because Paul would be sinning if he said it really is better if you don't marry. Right, so Paul seems to believe that being single could be a good thing in ministry. And all of you know that. You don't want to be unmarried, but you also know that if you were not married, your capacity for ministry would be much greater. Now that's not always true, right? I mean, sometimes coming home to a peaceful home with a good relationship is invigorating you for ministry, but all of us know that we have that tension between our families and our ministry. And sometimes we damage our families because we have to minister. And it's very difficult to be married to or a child of a minister sometimes because they feel neglected. That often happens. So we wouldn't say it is necessary, but it is obviously the natural way of things. So men and women, it's often assumed, but not all men and women will marry. And there are different reasons for that, right? In a non-traditional culture, it's much harder because you don't have your parents help you find, right? And your expectations of marriage. Today's expectations of marriage are far different from what they used to be or what they were in a traditional culture, right? You want to find your soulmate. In many traditional cultures, they barely know the person they're marrying. And then they get to know each other. And amazingly, they're usually successful marriages. But we may not want to model ourselves after some of those because the roles within marriage are often very traditional. The Bible doesn't tell us the woman must always be the one cooking. Okay? The Bible doesn't tell us the woman must always be the one bathing the children. It doesn't give specifics like that. Okay? So marriage is much harder today because of the confusion about roles. Okay? Women working as well as the men, and so all of that, and women being well educated. So marriage has become much more difficult in our modern age than it used to be. It points to Jesus. Now, if I was going to apply this passage, I could just talk about marriage. And when you preach, now this is where I'm getting off onto what would be another course, really. But when you preach, you have to first know the main point of the passage. Now, we've already established that. But then what's the next thing you do? If I've decided that I need to, the Scripture's telling me that it is important for the man, but really for both, it's important for companionship, that's extremely important. Do I just tell people that? Is my preaching simply going to be making that statement that you were made to be married or you were made to be at least in a relationship? Okay, whether it be romantic or even just, but you really are not made to be alone. right? We are made to have some kind of, we're made to have friendships. We're made to have the church, so we should have other relationships in our life. I think we can apply this passage to that and say it's not only about marriage. The idea is it's just not good for us to be a lone person. That's not the way we were made. When you preach, what you should first do, of course, is know what the main point is. But then you've got to say, now, why do I need to tell the people this? Why is it important that I tell people that we are not meant to be loners, people all by ourselves? Okay? Why would I need to tell people this? Now, if you understand the answer, if you get the answer to this question, then you're really far along in understanding how to apply passages. Okay? Why would I need to tell people? It's not good for a man or a woman to be totally alone. It's just not good. Anybody? Why would I need to tell people this? Luna, do you know?
Yeah, I'm
You're smiling. No?
Maybe human beings are independent. I'm not. No, they're not independent. Dependent on something else. If the man is dependent on the woman, or the woman is dependent on the man, it implies that everyone should be dependent on God or the Creator.
Okay. Ruth?
Yeah, maybe because we are created in God's image.
Yes.
In God's image, when He said He didn't say let me create. He said let us create.
Yes.
And so that us, there's the Father, and there's the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that image is existent. And so if we're created in that image, we have to exist like our image.
Now, the Trinity might be one of the clues there that, yes, God lives in fellowship. It's a mystery to us, right? Our Muslim friends or enemies really attack us on this doctrine of the Trinity that we can barely explain. One God, three persons, in fellowship with each other. And each have different roles, which is also interesting. Okay? So we were naturally made for that. But what we need to preach to, of course, is, and Solomon was kind of getting along that line, is that it actually is our tendency to want to be independent, to want to be our boss, not to be accountable to somebody else. And so that's the sin that we often need to confront in a sermon. Okay? Is our tendency not to have the friendships we should have. Okay? Marriage in itself, you can also talk about that, about when you go into marriage, how do you avoid falling into the sins that so many couples do? What's some of the tensions that married couples have? Okay, some of your counselors. What are some of the reasons for tension in a marriage? Okay, and they may all boil down to some of the same things. Sorry? Communication is a big one, right? Communication. Premarital counseling is supposed to address that. You can't fix it if they're bad communicators, but you have to. One of the things that premarital counseling should do is, even if it doesn't make them better communicators, you say, so what are you going to do? How are you going to spend your holidays? You ask them, how are you going to deal with the other person's family? Who's going to handle money in your family? You ask questions like that because it may be things that they haven't even thought about, or they think, well, I'm going to do it the same way my parents did it. But if you don't talk about that, tension. So premarital counseling should open up all that communication before they marry, so they already know, and so it's not a big surprise of what, well, I expect you to do all the cooking. Oh, we didn't talk about that. I don't like to cook. So all of those things should be brought up. Communication is a huge one. Sorry? Yeah, money's a big problem. So but generally, what all these things are, money, children, how to raise them, how to discipline, all those kinds of things, they usually just come from sin. They just come from sin. And a lot of the sin we have in a marriage is we have these demands on the other person, and we get very angry when they don't meet them. Okay, that's usually what happens in a marriage. Okay, you're spending too much money. I'm really angry about that. Or you're not helping me do this. Or I expect you to wait on me all the time, and you're not doing it. We have these expectations. If a woman marries because she wants to be secure, I don't know that happens as much today, but that used to be the main reason a woman would marry. Would be, I need to be secure. My role is to have children. I need a protector, and so therefore I marry. That's very traditional. Okay. If you look to your wife or husband to meet all of your needs, That's sin. Right? It's impossible for a spouse to meet all our needs. Just impossible. God has designed marriage where many of our needs should be met that way, but we get so angry when they are not. And so a sin issue comes in here when our expectations are, I might put on my wife expecting her to build me up, to make me feel respectable and all that kind of stuff, and a woman might say, I need to feel loved. It's the Lord that should actually do that for us. So some of the ways he does it is through our spouse. But ultimately, who is our helper? Who is the one that we're actually made for a relationship with the Lord? And so you can bring this passage into that and say, don't make marriage what your relationship with Jesus should be. Okay? And so you have to find a sin issue, something that when I read this, how do I react? What do I do wrong? So Adam and Eve, there's no sin in chapter 2. Sometimes there's a blatant sin. I see that, and then I can quickly relate. Oh, they're committing idolatry. We commit idolatry. Okay, that's good. But in chapters 1 and 2, everything's perfect. Everything's the way it should be, and we are not. And we see tension. And you see what happens as soon as Eve gives the fruit to Adam. They both eat it, and crash. The woman you gave me, right? The finger pointing goes everywhere. So sin has quickly come into their relationship with each other and with God. So, we've really answered the application. I think the application here would be that God has made us never to be alone. He has given us marriage as one of the ways to help that, but it's not ultimately what God wants for us. He wants us to have that relationship with Him as our husband. So even men, we can speak that way, that God's my husband. He's the husband of the church. And He is the only one who can really meet our deepest needs. And that's where we look for it. So God, in His grace, has given us, some of us have excellent husbands and wives that meet so many of our needs. God bless you if that's the case. Other people have marriages where they're not able to. Maybe one of the ones is sick and there's no more sexual relation in the marriage. That can be a very devastating thing where that's just no longer possible, and they're still young. But that does happen. Okay? Well, it's not that God's going to give you sex, but what you're looking for, He can give you. He can give you that contentment. He can give you that fulfillment. Okay? So that's one of the ways that we would go about preaching from that epic. Anybody have a question? Yes, sir.
I have a question about the word helper.
The word
Helper.
helper. Yes.
Because it implies most people about inferiority. It shows inferiority.
It does. But God is also our helper, it says in Scripture. It says in the Psalms. Right? So it depends on, but God is not subservient to us. So what does it mean that she is to be a helper? Okay? But we are, Jesus said, I came not to be served, but to serve, and to give my life as a ransom for many. So Jesus has helped us in that way too. God helps us in giving us all that we need and in giving us salvation. Generally, though, He's my little helper. It's a subservient thing that we think about. Now, the relationships between men and women is an extremely complicated thing, as you know. Look at what Scripture says, but we always have to look at it in our culture as well. So in other words, are wives to submit to their husbands in the 21st century? Should wives submit to their husbands? Yes, but what it looks like is not going to be the same as it looked 2,000 years ago. Any man is a fool who doesn't listen to his educated wife for advice. That's just foolish, right? So the submission is a much more complicated. In fact, sometimes the woman, my wife is probably smarter than I am, and I'm very aware of that. So I am foolish if I don't make sure that I consult with her before we make it. I don't make decisions by myself. And it's difficult. It's difficult for a woman to submit to a man, especially if she thinks he's going wrong, or doing the wrong thing. I'm not talking about sin. I'm just talking about something unwise. Okay? If the man just says, okay, we're going to move to Nairobi, that's extremely difficult for the woman to just say, okay, let's go. It shouldn't work that way, but it did in the past. Wherever he goes, just you go. And you have to take that into consideration. And as a man and as a minister, I've taken my family places where they might not otherwise have wanted to go, trying to convince my wife that, yeah, this is a good thing, let's go.
But sometimes the culture affects our decisions.
Culture definitely affects it. Yeah, I mean, and we have to be very careful about that because culture can be very sinful. I think in anthropology and sociology we are taught, no, culture is not moral, but it is. There's a lot of sin in culture. And we have to be able to point it out and say, wait, that's cultural, that's not biblical. Okay, so we want to make sure we understand what the Bible says, but the Bible does not say the man just sits there and the woman waits on him. It doesn't say that anywhere. Okay? Of course, we're also told, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church. I mean, that might be harder than submitting. I mean, that's a very, very big role, and I think a lot of men totally ignore that. No, the woman must submit and I do whatever I want. So it's a lot of sin in marriage. So you can preach about marriage just from this passage because this is the basis of marriage. Any questions? Because we're going to move on to another epic. Okay, I'm going to have you do a passage or two on your own just for practice. We get to Genesis 3, and I'd like us to look at what happens in the garden. I think you all know, but in Genesis 3, we have some puzzling things, like the whole thing about the serpent. Right? Obviously, Satan possesses the serpent, takes over the serpent. It's all mysterious to us. But the serpent comes to the woman. Why didn't he come to Adam? Why did he come to Eve?
He's the one who gives him
We do know that God speaks directly to Adam. We don't know that he doesn't speak to Eve. Okay? We're not quite sure. But it is interesting that the serpent goes to Eve rather than to Adam.
The soft side.
Now, Paul makes a point of that later. Sorry?
That is the softer side of human.
The softer side. I mean, is it because she's stupid? Right? Is it because she's more open to accept wrong ideas? Some people would say that. But I think one reason he comes to Eve is because he knows that Adam is actually the head of the marriage. But he goes to Eve. And so he messes things up and he says, you can make this decision. And Adam, like a fool, is standing there with her the whole time and says nothing. So Adam really falls short here. So we always talk about Adam's sin. We almost never say Eve's sin. We say Adam's sin. Isn't it interesting? Because Adam really is, I would say, more responsible here for not stepping in and saying, hold it! Okay, we're not going to do this. Okay, he didn't do that. Okay, and that would have been acceptable, certainly in their marriage. Without sin, if he had taken over and said no. But for some reason, he watches and he allows this to happen. So Satan he tries to disrupt the marriage relationship, letting her make the decision for both of them, and you see what happens. So as soon as they eat, now, by the way, why does the woman take the fruit, eat it, and give it to her husband? Why does she do this? This is a big question. What's behind it? What makes her do this? Now don't say the serpent, right? That's too easy, right? Why is the temptation successful?
Seduction.
Sorry?
Seduction.
Well, she is seduced in a non-sexual way, but it is seduction that occurs. But why is it? I mean, if we sin, and we do, many times we are conscious that we are choosing what we know is wrong, but would be pleasurable. For 5 minutes, or whatever. Like, I'm so angry at her. I just want to tell her what I think of her. You know it's wrong to do that. But you do it. You feel good for a minute, and then, of course, then you know it's wrong. Hopefully. Right? When we make a choice to sin, and as Christians, I think most of the time, when we sin, we know full well that we are sinning. Very quickly in our minds, we make the decision, this is wrong, I'm going to do it anyway. For Eve, there's no sin yet. And so this is the difficult part to understand. How is it that she can say, yeah, this is a good idea? If she eats the fruit, what's going to happen? What does she think is going to happen?
She
I'll be like God. I'll be like God. And knowing good and evil, because that's what Satan says. Satan tells both of them, but particularly Eve, God's lying to you, you know. God told you that, you know, if you eat this, you'll die, but you won't die. Instead, you'll be just like him. So Eve, in her mind, must be thinking, God must be a liar. So now we start to see it develop. God must be a liar. God's keeping something good for me. Okay? I can be like God. All these things are actually sin. All these things. And when they are working in our heart and mind, I don't know. We don't see the process. But all of those things must be true. So many times when people preach from this passage, all they do is they say, Adam and Eve were disobedient. And look what happened. Don't be disobedient. Okay, that's a bad application. Because we need to see why she's prompted to be disobedient. Because why are the same sins we have in our hearts? So she questions God. So do we. She may think God does not always tell the truth. Now, I don't know if you would admit to that. You may think God doesn't always give you what's good and keeps things back from himself. And so that's why we do some of the things we do. Right? Well, I need to commit adultery because my wife is not fulfilling me. She's not pretty anymore. You know, all those kinds of ideas that I must do this because God's not giving me what I need. Those kinds of things are much more powerful to preach from if we can see what's going on likely in her mind and then what goes on in our mind and hearts as well. Then we can preach better. So we don't just make this a passage about obedience and disobedience. It's about a people who do not trust God. Okay? They do not trust God. They do not believe him. And that's a huge sin. When you preach, you have to convince people that they're guilty of the sin you're talking about. Or you have no sermon. So you have to, if you're preaching from this, you have to show people, you know, have you ever doubted God? Have you ever doubted that he really wants the best for you? Everybody has experienced that. The best preacher will do that, will draw that out and say, yes, I do that. I'm just like Eve. And then you've got something you can preach to. Okay? But if you just say, don't be disobedient, that'd be very shallow. And I don't think it would be as successful a message as if you go deeper into the heart. So we see now many things change because they eat from the fruit. What things happen now? What happens as a result? Sorry? Their eyes are open, right? Suddenly they're embarrassed. I'm naked. Okay? They're husband and wife. But they just suddenly realize they feel inferior suddenly. They feel like everybody's looking at them. I don't know. But suddenly it becomes an issue. So shame is a brand new thing now. Shame has now come. What else? Now, that's the first thing they notice. It's like, you know, we're naked. We shouldn't be naked. They start what?
They start to feel guilt.
Well, now they also know that God's going to be angry, right? And so they know now that God is not going to look on them with favor, right? In their relationship, okay? When God comes and speaks to them, he says, now your desire, woman, is going to be to overrule your husband, but he will always have dominion over you. So he's already saying there is going to be tension now in husband-wife relationships that you will always face. All of humanity is going to face that tension of how do you love and submit without sinning? How do you make that a good marriage? That's always going to be the case. The woman will now have children with pain, with great pain. She hadn't had children yet, but you will have children. Adam, you're going to work the ground, but now it's going to be difficult work. It's going to be really hard work. You're going to sweat as you work, but you will bear fruit. So, and then of course they're cast out of the garden. They're cast out. So you see that sin comes into the world. One of the things we can stress is that those things are not supposed to be. Our work is not supposed to be so difficult. Ministry, okay, sweeping the streets, none of the work that we do is supposed to be difficult and make us tired and make us hate our work. It's supposed to be a good thing, but now it will no longer be. Now, I feel very blessed, and I hope that you do too. I love my job. I love what I do. It's not always easy, but I love what I do. So many people, they work really, really hard, and they don't bear a lot of fruit from it. So that's a curse. work is not a curse. Okay? It's difficult work that is a curse. That work is so hard for us that it ages us, it wears us out. Having children is a blessing, but the pain involved in having children is a curse. And every time a woman gives birth, I imagine she probably thinks about Eve and what she did that brought this in, okay, because now it's going to be painful. But children are to be born. So I'm on page 19, the ethic of the fall. Go ahead.
About their eyes open.
Yes.
There is a time gap between when she ate and when Adam ate.
Right.
But their eyes opened when Adam ate, not when she ate. Why?
Yeah, well, that's a question of, how quickly did they... I mean, they may have eaten together, but...
There is a time gap.
Yeah, but it's true. It's when Adam actually eats the fruit also that suddenly their eyes are open. So whether there's a delay, why there's a delay, I don't know.
Would it be any implications that the man is the head of the family or the human beings, that his eatings affect really the humankind, not hers eating?
I don't know that I'd want to say that specifically. The way that Satan goes about attacking through the wife is part of that. Like, again, Adam was not the husband he was supposed to be by defending her, by keeping that from happening, okay, by trying to protect her spiritual welfare. He failed completely. I don't know that I'd make a big thing of when he eats now their eyes are open. I don't know.
Why I'm sharing his question is there are people who says the eatings of the women will not be affected.
Never heard this.
Yeah.
Yeah, I doubt it. I don't see any reason to make a big case of that it's not until Adam eats. But again, Adam is always, from then on, given the blame for the sin. Okay? And when the fall happens, we see the results of the fall from chapter 3 all the way on to chapter 11 when we get to the Tower of Babel. Let's just talk about this one generally. As soon as they're cast out of the garden, we get to chapter 4. And chapter 4 in Genesis is about Cain and Abel. And what you should notice is how quickly the worst kinds of sin are manifested. I mean, immediately, these boys grow up, so I mean, it's obviously, a period of time. But murder, I mean, what a horrible crime. And what it shows you is the result of sin can now allow a brother to kill his brother. So I think we're supposed to be struck with what a horrible crime that is, which tells you it's amazing what people are capable of. Okay, because sin has come into the world, what people are capable of. When Cain kills Abel, he certainly knows that it's wrong. He knows that it's a sinful thing to do, and of course he lies to God and so on. I want to say something about the mark of Cain, because I suspect that raises questions. When God tells Cain, now you're going to be a wanderer. You're going to wander all over, and your farming is going to be difficult. Cain says, oh, this is so difficult, and whoever sees me will kill me. And he says, not so. Yeah, I'm going to put a mark on you. What do you think that means? What do you think that means? I'm going to put a mark on you so that nobody will kill you. What do you think?
It's Christ.
Well, I wouldn't know. We're not going to say that it's Christ. We can find maybe that as pointing to Christ, right? But it's not like he puts Christ